The common myths and misconceptions is that people with BPD can be like intentionally manipulative or attention seeking. And I really want to bust this myth.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ashani Dante, and this is But Are You Happy? A Mamma Mia mental health podcast for people who look calm on the outside, but really, they've got 10 tabs open on the inside.
And I'm Dr. Anastasia Hronis, clinical psychologist. Now, look, the chances are that if you've clicked on this episode, then you might be interested to learn a little bit more about borderline personality disorder and perhaps some of the myths that surround it.
But before we bust some myths, I'm actually curious to hear from you. What actually is a personality disorder?
Good starting place. What is a personality disorder? So a personality disorder is a mental health condition that myself and fellow psychologists can diagnose. It essentially refers to a series of patterns in a person's life, patterns of behaving, emotional patterns, cognitive thought patterns that cause problems or distress for a person. It's quite a complex diagnosis, but really what we're looking at are these patterns that cause difficulties for people, and often these patterns are pervasive across many different domains in their life. So they affect their friendships, their family life, their sense of self, their sense of emotion regulation, etc. It goes across a lot of different domains.
It's really great that we're talking about it because I feel like I didn't know much about BPD and personality disorders. So like I'm also curious, like are there different types of BPD?
There's different types of personality disorders.
Right.
So borderline personality disorder that we'll talk about is one of them. But personality disorders are essentially grouped into three different clusters or types. So cluster A is what we sort of refer to as the personality disorders that where people might have more sort of odd or eccentric types of presentations. So we have paranoid personality disorders, schizoid personality disorders where people are very sort of cold and detached from others, schizotypal personality disorders, often where people can have quite odd or eccentric or almost like fantastical kind of ideas and beliefs. So that's our cluster A. Cluster B, we have the more emotional and sometimes kind of dramatic personality disorders within this cluster. So this is where our borderline personality disorder fits in. But also within this cluster, we have antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. And then the final cluster, cluster C, is our sort of anxious and fearful and avoidant kind of cluster. So people can have an avoidant personality disorder where they avoid many things in their life. We all sometimes avoid, but again, we're thinking about these like deeply ingrained rigid patterns that people might have. We can have people who have a dependent personality disorder. So this is where someone feels like they really need to depend on others or a specific person to be able to essentially function in the world or feel safe in the world. And then we have our obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So different to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder.
Which we've talked about before.
We did some myth busting on that.
Yeah.
Yes. This is a personality disorder. So essentially we see patterns of rigidity that are pervasive across a person's life. So that's a bit of an overall
and there's
snapshot.
Lots of different clusters, lots of different types, how it presents.
Right.
Yeah, wow. Who offers the best advice in your family? Is it you? Play the Medibank Family Roast to find out. A card game designed to get families connecting and talking. Because when the bonds of family are stronger, Australia is stronger. So get around the dinner table, a tasty conversation is about to be served. Search Medibank Family Roast. Live better with Medibank. So what is a borderline personality disorder?
Yeah, so borderline personality disorder is one of our more common personality disorders. The research tells us it affects about 2 to 5% of the population.
That's not a lot, right? If you think about different mental health conditions.
Yeah. It's I mean, it's a fair chunk of people, really, if we think about it. And so what we find are some of the common kind of themes and patterns we see with people with borderline personality disorder is an instability in terms of their relationship with other people, but also the relationship with themselves. So they often have a sense of not having a well-formed identity. We can often see these pervasive patterns and fears around abandonment. So feeling like someone will leave me or abandon me. A person can experience sort of chronic emotion dysregulation through their life. They can have challenges and difficulties with anger, and they can sometimes also display patterns of self-destructive behavior. So that's sort of some of the key features that we might see in a person who has borderline personality disorder.
And it's interesting too, because as you're talking about it, like, I'm sure people are tuning in being like, oh, I have a bit of that, or I have a bit of that. And it's very easy in the age we live in that we can self-diagnose or think that we fall under a category. So what would be different from someone who has a borderline personality disorder to, oh, okay, I've got a bit of that, I got a bit of this?
Yes, that's a good question. So firstly, we're looking for a specific cluster of symptoms. So it's not just about one symptom. So when we diagnose borderline personality disorder, a person needs to have 5 of 9 symptoms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
So there
it's
is a
about
bit of a
the
criteria.
cluster.
Yeah.
Yep. And we're looking at kind of patterns that cause distress. So what we see is that, so these interpersonal difficulties, for example, it's not just with one person. They might play out with a lot of different people in a person's life, where they feel like they're repeating these same patterns with their partner, with their parents, with their sibling, with their friends, with their work colleagues. And it's sort of these patterns that play out across domains.
Yeah, that's a really good way to discern between that.
Yes.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah. So why does it exist?
Yeah, so personality disorders, and specifically a borderline personality disorder, is often thought to be a manifestation of trauma, essentially, complex trauma. We look at borderline personality disorder through the lens of what we call the biosocial model. So this essentially means that there are biological elements as well as social or environmental elements that have come together to create the challenges for a person that they're experiencing.
Yep.
So from that biological lens, we find that many people who have a borderline personality disorder may have what we refer to as emotional sensitivity. Now, I want to be really clear here that when I'm saying sensitivity, this is in no way a way of saying that, like, oh, you're too sensitive.
Yeah.
Because that's often how people have heard the word sensitivity used. Like, you're too sensitive, as in, like, you need to just get over it.
Yeah, totally.
Everyone exists on a spectrum of emotional sensitivity.
Yeah.
And being emotionally sensitive can actually be a real gift. We can be very in tune with other people. Those who are emotionally sensitive are often very empathetic, very kind, very compassionate to others.
Yeah.
There's lots of benefits. But it also means that when things are hard, they feel those things more deeply and more intensely.
Yeah.
And so there's a few key features with this biological sensitivity that maybe I'll actually draw out for you on a bit of a graph. I love a graph. If I draw kind of like an X and Y axis, there we go. So basically, what we might find for someone who isn't emotionally sensitive is that as their day progresses, so this is time, something happens that, you know, is not the greatest, and they have some kind of emotional reaction and feeling about that. Ouch, that hurt. And then I come back down. I keep going along my day. Something else might happen. Oh, that wasn't the best. But I come back down. Someone who has a heightened emotional sensitivity might go through their day. They might feel that same kind of trigger point, but they feel emotions more intensely. So they go, ooh, ouch, that hurt.
Higher.
I'm up here. So they have heightened emotional sensitivity and reactivity. Then they also take longer to come back down to their baseline. Now, as they're coming back down, trigger 2 happens, right? So I'm already up here. Ouch. Now I'm up here again. And so what we find is that people can end up yo-yoing up in this heightened space where everything just feels a lot and very overwhelming and just a bit too much.
Yeah.
And I'll draw this graph out for people who have a diagnosis of BPD and that I'm working with. And most times when I show people this, they're like, yes, that is what I feel. I get stuck up in that heightened state of distress and it feels very hard to come back down.
That must be quite a healing moment in a way to know that you feel seen. Because when you experience it, it's one thing, but then to have someone like a therapist that helps you give language and helps you to know that that must be really comforting to have a bit more clarity around it.
Yeah, and that you have an emotional system that just works a bit differently to someone else.
Yeah. And that would be quite exhausting, right? Because they're not able to go back to that baseline as like
Yes.
compared to the other graph that you did.
It's hard to stay in that heightened space for a long time.
Wow. Okay, so that was the biology part of it. What about the social part of it?
Yes. So the kind of social element that we really focus on and consider for borderline personality disorder is people have often had experiences of chronic invalidation. So what I mean by this is that if you have someone who has a sensitive emotional system as a child, they're feeling things more, they're having big emotional expressions, if those have been unintentionally or intentionally dismissed or invalidated, that can be a really hard experience for that young person growing up with all these feelings, feeling like they shouldn't be feeling all those feelings.
Yeah.
So we have this kind of coming together of biological sensitivity and chronic patterns of invalidation and trauma that combine to create this feeling of just like dysregulation in adult life.
Since this is a myth-busting episode, I'm curious to know from you, what are the common myths that you hear around borderline personality disorder?
Yes. I think the common myths and misconceptions is that people with BPD can be like intentionally manipulative or attention seeking. And I really want to bust this myth because no one chooses to have a personality disorder, right? Like no one chooses this experience of dysregulation for themselves. It's really hard to live with. And unfortunately, it can play out in ways that can appear quite destructive for people. But it really has a significant impact on their life. And so I think it's important for us to kind of catch ourselves if we sort of interpret someone's behavior who has BPD as being sort of manipulative or attention seeking, because really, ultimately, we're working with someone who is trying to get their emotional needs met, but perhaps haven't been shown how to do that or had experiences of how to do that in kind of healthy and adaptive ways.
That's so true. It's a bit like, not judging a book by its cover. Like we might not actually know, we might not know if a person's diagnosed with BPD, but we should hold the lens of compassion, and we don't know what's going on for them.
Exactly. One more myth I want to bust about BPD, and this is like an exciting one for me.
Yeah.
is historically it was thought that people with personality disorders, and specifically borderline personality disorder, couldn't get better. It was a lifelong diagnosis. So once you were diagnosed with it, and typically we don't diagnose anyone with it until they're minimum 16, ideally adulthood. Yes. So, but the idea was that this was a diagnosis for life. I want to bust that myth. People can absolutely overcome a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I have worked with a number of clients where at the end of treatment, we have like officially undiagnosed them. And like we've written in their notes and to the GP and everything, like this person no longer meets criteria for BPD.
That's so special.
It's some of the highlights I've had in therapy, really special moments. So I definitely want to bust that myth. It's not necessarily a lifelong condition.
That's really good to know. So speaking of treatment, what is the best way to treat it?
So our gold standard evidence-based treatment for borderline personality disorder is something called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT.
So many acronyms.
Yes,
DBT, DBT, la la la. Yeah.
Yes, and DBT has a really interesting kind of story behind the development of it that I'll share. So historically, the older therapies that came before DBT, which was developed in the early 90s, were very change focused. It was all about how do I change my thoughts? How do I change my behaviors? How do I change my emotions? And that can be really helpful and useful for certain people with certain mental health conditions. However, what was found was that for people who've had experiences of trauma, as many people with personality disorders have, this can be a highly invalidating approach. To just focus on change can feel like it sort of misses the mark. And so DBT recognized this. It was developed by Marsha Linehan, and it said that she herself had borderline personality disorder and went on this quest to kind of improve the treatments that existed. And so she really looked a lot into kind of Eastern philosophies and essentially brought together change-based strategies and principles with more acceptance-based strategies as well. So how can we help a person change, but how can we also help them be accepting of the reality that they find themselves in? And it's this kind of, this is the core dialectic. It's called dialectical behavior therapy. This is the core dialectic that DBT is based on. How do we help a person change what's within their control and accept the things that are outside of their control?
That's really cool to see the evolution of that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's really cool. So what are, with this therapy approach, like what are some of the key skills that someone would get from this?
Yeah, so DBT's kind of got 4 modules of skills within it. It's very practical and skills-based. So there is a module around mindfulness. So again, helping people develop those acceptance-based skills. There's a module around interpersonal effectiveness. So how can I improve my relationships with other people? There's a module on distress tolerance. So when I feel those big 8, 9, 10 out of 10 feelings, when rational brain is offline and emotional brain is firing, how can I build some skills to help me in those real kind of crisis moments? And then finally, there's a module around emotion regulation. So on a day-to-day level, how do I kind of go with the ebbs and flows emotionally that come up for me and keep me within a window that feels workable?
Those are really great key skills. I'm kind of like, I could do with some of that. You know what I mean?
Skills that everyone can benefit from.
Yeah.
Yep.
So for anyone tuning in that might know someone with BPD or they have BPD themselves, what would be a takeaway you would want to leave for them?
I'd first want to lean in with compassion and say it is hard to experience these things on a day-to-day basis. But the positive message here is that there are treatments like DBT and others that are available that can really help people manage and overcome some of these patterns they find themselves living with.